Hello again everyone. Today we'll be going through a very important concept around trading pieces, and it is called relative value of chess pieces. If you're always wondering about how to make a good trade in chess, perhaps this is a video for you. In fact, I can go as far as saying that every theme, such as pawn sacrifice, rook sacrifice, or even a queen sacrifice, all stems out from this very concept. In fact, if you wanted to, you can get into my video that I made previously about exchange sacrifice to see if it makes sense. Now before going into the technical stuff, I suppose we all know the intrinsic value of the chess pieces, right? And that is the arbitrary value that we all assign to the chess pieces. Pawn as 1, the knight and bishop as 3, rook as 5, and the queen as 9. That is the easy part. What does not come easy is to evaluate the value of the pieces as the game progresses. In fact, one of the very examples that I got you today shows you the very basic examples of my own game recently. Now I understand you do not want to look at amateur's game. I'm rated about 1900 to 2000. But this is also to show you that people at my level actually blunders to a very basic mistake like this. You will understand once the game goes on. But if you take a glance at this position, what is probably better, right? In this position, trying to attack the c6 pawn, I have to defend. And it seems like in several moves, white really has no breakthrough. He plays b4. Probably next will be a3, trying to get this knight to a5, to b7, and try to repeat that way. I have one weakness on the queen side, but it is protected. And so overall, perhaps it's stable. Neither side was really able to get access to infiltrate and cause harm on the opponent's territory. But that was until my opponent moved his knight here to c5 after I played rook to c7. Now this move allows a bishop for a knight trade, and the seemingly small trade is the one trade that I need to actually gain a breakthrough into the position. Because the imbalances in this position is that I have a knight and he has a bishop, and that probably changes every evaluation that we have right now. The bishop being locked inside this pawn chain really cannot have a breakthrough. But this knight on b8 is different. He can jump to a6, to c7, perhaps I can play pawn to d4, knight to d5, it attacks pawn to f4 next, attacks pawn to b4, but the bishop is stuck. It cannot get off the pawn chain, so it's just a big pawn right here on d2. In fact, after rook to a7, rook to c2 to protect the only pawn that is weak right here, I play rook to a3, preventing him to have a breakthrough on the queen side. And at this point, I'm not worried about bishop to c1 because I have rook to g3. I'm already inside the pawn chain. I can start taking pawns if I wanted to. So he plays king to g2. But the point is that the knight is really useful here, while the bishop is actually very useless, being stuck in a pawn chain. And so even both of them has the value of 3, let's say, has the point of 3 as we like to put it. The bishop here is just a giant big pawn, where its power cannot be used. And so the relative value of this bishop actually has to go down. It cannot be 3 in this position. If anything, I want to give it 1 because it's just a pawn right here. But the knight is different. The knight can relocate. As you can see, the knight here is already jumping onto d5, attacking some of the critical square on the opponent's king side, and also in the center, by the way. White is so helpless that it can only march his king back and forth towards g2 and h2 over here. And I mean, it does not really take much from here for black to win the game. And so I will not continue any further. You can use stockfish if you wanted to help you out. But in general, you get the idea where white is the one who has his hands tied and pretty much kaput sooner or later. And so really, if anything else, he cannot trade on c5 with knight to c5. The correct move to actually maintain stability will be something like knight to a5, where yes, both sides has a bishop and a knight, and so really, if anything, I also have a useless bishop right here, right? Staring into his pawn chain. Probably this will still be stable. But knight to c5 traded off my worst piece, which is the bishop here, for his good knight. And the turnaround is that I have a good knight versus the bad bishop here that is sitting on d2. And so that's the first game. I hope I provided a good stepping stone. Let's just move on to the second one. Now this second game aims to show you how to neutralize your opponent's attack by using this very same concept that we talked about, which is the relative value. Now let's start by evaluating the pieces, right? This bishop on d2 catches my attention because it's the same as the one we talked about, a useless giant big pawn. This bishop on d3 though is a good piece. Later on, when you push your pawn to the king's side, this bishop will help out in the attack as well. In any case, it can also be sacrificed on the square here on a7 to deliver a mate. The queen and rook is actually just well placed, trying to checkmate black here as soon as possible. But black is also not without advantage, right? This bishop here is nicely placed, all the way to h1 diagonal. The only thing I'll say is perhaps this bishop now is not really attacking anything, and so perhaps the relative value cannot be 3, but somewhere along 2.5 maybe. You get the idea. The knight here is not very well placed. It is on g6 and it's going to be attacked by pawn to h4, pawn to f4 and so on. and so it also cannot be 3, right? Something like 2 maybe, or 2.5. And so in this position, after pawn to f4, what would you play as black in this position to actually neutralize white's attack? As you can see, white is the one who is putting pressure with all his pawns, and so how will you do in this position to actually defend, and if anything, to gain an advantage? Pause the video if you wanted to, follow along. I'll give you a couple of seconds. Now it's actually the very same theme again, which is to trade off this bishop here on d3, which is good, and leave this bishop here on d2, which is pretty bad one. And so black in this position plays knight to e7. Idea of course is to get off the pawn storm right here on the king's side, but also to reroute this knight to a better square like f5. After h4, knight to f5, attacking the rook. Of course the bishop takes, the pawn takes. Yeah, white just doesn't want to do that, because the bishop here on d2 is just very useless. You trade off one of your most valuable pieces, which is bishop on d3, and so perhaps white doesn't want to do that. And why did he do that? He plays rook to h3, and after knight to d6, the point is made clear that black wants to play bishop to e4, trade off that bishop on d3. Now if white plays bishop to e2, then suddenly he's getting off the attack on the long diagonal here towards the king's side. And what will happen instead is black will play bishop to e4. Something like this protects the pawn here on the king's side. It puts a lot more pressure on the light square diagonal around the king's side right here. And so suddenly the bishop that we talk about being 2.5 right here on b7 can now pretty much worth around 3 or 4 in this position. And the bishop on d3 that we talked about last few moves being 3 or 4 decreases in value because it's no longer attacking the king's side. It is moved backward, and there is no clear prospect on this diagonal as well. And so the value cannot be 3. Perhaps it would go down to 2 or 1 in this position. It doesn't really matter. The problem is you're trying to depreciate the value and try to increase your own. Now in the game, white continues with the attack, but after bishop to e4, there's no way that you can actually just avoid this bishop trade. And so after the trade, you can see that the knight here instead is the best placed piece on the board, while the bishop here is just rubbish. Now you might think that the attack here on the king's side will compensate for anything, but it does not do anything. For example, pawn to g6, I can play pawn to f6, I can play pawn to f5, possible as well. And if pawn to h6, probably I'll just play pawn to g6. Locked up the position, white cannot make an advance here, and the only thing that is left is the bishop here on d2, which is a rubbish, garbage as I said. And so white continues first with queen to g2, trying to dislodge the knight here on e4. But we have queen to d5, protecting the knight. And after g6, as I said, I can even take pawn to h6, queen to h1. The attack does not amount to anything. Black has not castled on the king's side yet, so the king is not under danger anytime soon. And even after castle, with the idea of bringing the rook here on the f file, is too much until white actually just, goes bamboozle. And doesn't win this position because he just doesn't have enough material to win, and in this position he just resigned. And so always have to have this kind of mental conversation, right, with yourself, that these pieces here can actually increase in value. They're not just a fixed value of 3. It actually depends a lot on this position. If you have a bishop or a rook and a queen even, and you can use them, probably those pieces are not going to mean anything as well. The same thing as when you have money but you can't use them. This is just going to be pathetic. It's better to have a little bit less money, but you can actually use them. Let's just put that as an analogy right here. In any case, let's just move on to the next one. Now for the third game, it's more or less the same, where the bishop here on b2 is actually just a pawn. The bishop here on g4 though is actually a very good piece, slicing towards his diagonal, supporting the push of e6 as well. Black's rook is actually pretty useless in terms of attacking and controlling the open file. As you can see, this rook is not activated. This rook on e7 is only protecting the king's side, and it's not really active. And so already you can say that the rook cannot be valued as 5 right here. Perhaps it's a 4, perhaps it's a 3. This rook here on e1 and f1 can be a 5 because it's attacking and supporting this pawn push, as I said, and so it's already being optimal. Now after black push pawn to a5, the plan continues with pushing the pawn to e6. And you can pause the video here to see what Tigran Petrosian did to pause all the pawn push from the center of the board and to actually render this rook useless here on e-file with one move. That one move is rook to e6. As we've talked about in this video over and over again, you have to trade your opponent's best piece for your own bad piece. And so even though the rook here is 5 and the bishop here is 3, but due to the nature of bishop being very active, you want to play rook to e6 to actually trade off the bishop for the pawn. For the rook. Also with the move rook to e6, we're trying to get the knight here onto e7 and to d5. Whereas you can see it actually forks down the rook and the queen. Now perhaps you might argue that, white does not really have to take on e6, right? He can actually move this rook to h3, pawn to h4, pawn to h5 for example, rook to g3, also very possible, but that is really his problem. He can always develop a piece to a better square. For example, right here, black can already play knight to e7. For example, let's just move a pawn here to g4. It does not matter. Well, black can already play knight to e7, knight to d5 being the next idea. Also just saying that d5 push is now impossible to play. But if the exchange is actually taken, you can see that the pawn here is actually controlling f5. It controls the d5 square. And so the knight here can be anchored here on d5. And suddenly all those prospects for white that we talked about in the beginning of the game is actually just lost. White just simply has no attack here, all for the cost of an exchange sacrifice right here. Now white here plays queen to f1 just to avoid the fork on d5, and after knight to d5, rook to f3, Tigran Petrosian plays bishop to d3, placing the bishop on a very strong diagonal. But here it is white's turn to actually sacrifice the rook. Again, not that the rook here is actually very useful, so he sacrificed the rook, and after the pawn takes, the queen takes. Now if white had just waited one turn, let's just say he plays queen to f2, then suddenly there will be pawn to b4, and after pawn takes b4, pawn takes b4, we can already see that black's probably the one who is winning with passed pawn here on the queen side. Suddenly the tables have turned around, all because of the exchange sacrifice that he did on e6. Reshevsky was smart enough to actually give up the exchange back to black, and eventually hold on with the rest of the pieces here. But eventually you can't really say that the bishop here on d2 is actually useful, because it's forever trapped behind the pawn chain. The game ended in a draw on this position because there's not enough pieces for black or for white to actually have a counterplay, but in any case, you get the idea, right? Even a simple sacrifice in exchange of sacrificing a rook can actually stem out from a very simple idea, which is a relative value. Now I just want to spend another minute here talking about The Game of Century by Bobby Fischer, just because I mentioned something about queen sacrifice earlier on. So just to show you something that is relevant till this day, I want to quickly show you this game to pay a tribute as well to Bobby Fischer. He was 16 years old at the time, but surely has the chess skills of a giant. In this position playing black, he placed knight to c3, and after pawn to c3 he placed knight to e4. Surely the best continuation for black. He is gaining a pawn on the center of the board, bringing his piece to the king's side and placing tons of pressure, right? As you can see, white is really not having much of a development right here. He's really lagging in development. So in this case, Bobby Fischer is not really concerned about bishop takes on e7, because he can just move his queen to b6. And look at all his pieces, right? Look at all white's pieces being stuck on the first rank. White wouldn't want to take on f8, because after bishop to f8, now we're attacking the queen again, we're just gaining tempo. And this, my friend, is how you gain activity of your pieces, by rendering your opponent's pieces useless. So no matter how many pieces your opponent has, if they're all stuck on the first rank, and they all chase around like this, as the queen is right now, let's say to b2, to b3, or b2 is actually hanging, so this is not available, but chase your opponent's piece around, and they are going to lose their value pretty soon. Donald understands how dire the situation is. He plays bishop to c4, just developing another pieces, holding the temptation of taking the rook because it's just not going to be that good. But here Bobby Fischer plays knight to c3, taking the advantage the queen cannot take on c3 because of the simple rook to e8. The king is not castled, and so the bishop here is already pinned, and it will be won next turn. So taking on c3 is actually a bad move, and so Donald brought his bishop back to c5, attacking the queen, right? But this is where you should pause the video and see what Bobby Fischer did that leads his game to be remembered even decades into the future, and perhaps even centuries into the future. Bobby Fischer plays rook to e8 check, and after king to f1, seemingly the only good move right here, Bobby Fischer continues with bishop to e6, outright sacrificing the queen here on b6. The idea is after bishop takes on b6, bishop takes on c4 check is a continuation. The next few moves may not seem pleasing for white because
check, check. Check, check, check.
But literally, black
check.
is in the loop of giving a check for white. So the most here that he has is a draw. But take a look at how useless this rook actually is. One of them on h1 is actually not doing anything. One of them on d1 is on the center, is developed, but it's actually not attacking anything. And so already on move 21, Bobby Fischer is already making move for himself, but also making move for his opponent. Because quite obviously, his opponent doesn't want to move in this way, where he just loses all these pieces. After rook to a4 right here, queen to b6, knight to d1. This queen is actually very offset. It is not clear what she's doing here on b6. And so yes, it might have the value of 9, but it's not attacking anything, so it's actually very useless. Say the value dropped to 7 or 6, right? And then the rook here on h1, that is practically stuck, and so the rook cannot worth more than 5. Here the game doesn't continue very long, because as you can see it is 3 pieces versus the queen here on b6. And black is just up a bunch of pawns that, in the end, it doesn't really matter if white has a queen, Black has all his army trying to run down the board and promote himself to a queen. And just after a few moves right here, you can see the sequence of checkmate, that leads to Donald's demise. But it all began in this position, right? Where Bobby Fischer recognizes that the rook here is stuck on h1, and so it's practically gone, and the queen is offset here on a3. And so Bobby Fischer understands that and decided to throw away his queen, but for a compensation of an active minor pieces that trap his opponent in infinity loop. Now we went through all of these, and granted we are all not some chess superstar, it will be difficult as accepting pineapple on the pizza to sacrifice your queen and call brilliancy. But rather this video is made to appreciate the common value in chess, and that is the piece activity, piece play, and a good piece trade. And hopefully with enough practice and pattern recognition, I can bring enough changes to the way you trade pieces in your game, and also how you evaluate your game overall. As usual, if you like this video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, it will mean a lot to me. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching. See you soon.